the major institutions in the society are under totalitarian control. After all, what's a corporation? You know, a corporation is just a tyrannical system, one of the most tyrannical systems that humans have ever devised. They've been given extraordinary rights by the courts, not by legislation, early in this century. They're, like the multilateral agreement, would give them actually the rights of states. They're basically unaccountable to the public. When they've been given the rights of persons, that means, for example, they have the right to propagandize. So, like, they've been given the rights of free speech, which is insane. You know, these are collectivist institutions. They've been given the right to advertise, in fact, at your expense. So you get the tax-free. So you pay for the privilege of having your minds destroyed. They own the information system. I mean, they control the information system. What are the media? You know, huge corporations, parts of bigger corporations. That sets the framework of discussion. The major decisions that affect what happens in the economy and social life are made behind closed doors. Very little public accountability. They have the right of freedom from search and seizure. You know, Fourth Amendment rights means you can't know anything about what they're doing. You know, and they have enormous power. Furthermore, I mean, it's described as free trade. It's ridiculous. I mean, these are secret institutions, so all figures have to be taken with a big grain of salt because nobody really knows. But the guesses are that, by international economists, that maybe 40% or so of U.S. trade is actually internal to corporations, meaning it's not trade at all. You know, it's just moving something across a border. It's no more trade than moving from Indiana to Illinois or something like that. Happens across a border, you know, to get cheaper labor, to avoid environmental restrictions and so on. Well, you know, 40% is not a small number. And that's a vast underestimate because there are also complicated strategic alliances among alleged competitors. So IBM and Toshiba and Siemens and so on are working together. You know, they're working together on design, on marketing, and so on. And in fact, it's gotten to the point where some international economists call it a new system of what they call alliance capitalism. You know, big networks of tyrannical institutions basically running the world. Outsourcing is one of the operations that take place within command economies. The economy is run by a network of command economies called corporations. I mean, what goes on internal to a corporation or a mega corporation is not free trade. It's command economy. A corporation is a totalitarian institution. You know, it has a board of directors at the top, a manager, he gives orders, everyone else follows them down at the bottom. At the very bottom, if you're lucky, you can rent yourself to it and get a job. And if you're sufficiently propagandized, you may even buy some of the junk they produce and so on. But it's certainly not, it has nothing to do with what you know, any classical economist would have called a free market. Outsourcing is just part of the technique. Outsourcing is internal to the corporation, right? The corporation picks some supplier to outsource to and keeps them under control, because then they can get much cheaper labor, hideous working conditions, don't have to worry about environmental controls. They get inputs to themselves, which are very cheap. That increase, for those of you who've studied economics, you know that increases productivity. If you get artificially cheap inputs, that increases productivity, because productivity is measured in terms of, you know, value produced divided by the number of workers. So you get nice measures of productivity, which have nothing to do with productivity. They just have to do with the fact that you've got 20-year-old women off the farms in China locked into factories and working until they die in a couple of years. That is very healthy for the economy. But it's all internal to big command economies. That's one of the reasons why the concept trade is so ridiculous. I mean, what's called trade would certainly not have been called trade by Adam Smith. Outsourcing happens to send goods across the border into the United States, but it's under the control of a command economy. In fact, a network of command economies, which work the way I just quoted, you know, the oligopolistic competition and strategic integration. And the same is true of most of what's called trade. I mean, nobody really studies this much, so you don't have really accurate numbers. But if you take the numbers that are guessed at by economists who look at it, take, say, NAFTA. One of the great things about NAFTA is supposed to have been that it increased trade between the U.S. and Mexico. Well, it certainly increased cross-border transfers of material objects. But is that trade? Well, it depends. It turns out that the percentage of interaction that's intra-firm, internal to a command economy, went from about 50% before NAFTA to about 2/3 after NAFTA. That's not trade any more than if GM shifts something from Indiana to Illinois. Happens across an international border so that you can take advantage of rotten working conditions and low wages and no environmental constraints, but it's no more trade than if the Kremlin moved something from Poland to Hungary or something like that. And in fact, it's very possible, if anybody ever bothered to study it, that actual trade has even declined since NAFTA. I mean, nobody studies it because it's the wrong questions to ask in the ideological framework that we're supposed to accept. But if you did ask it, you might very well find that, just as it turns out after NAFTA that, another great thing about NAFTA for Mexico is that foreign investment shot up, which it did. But a little footnote is that total investment declined because Mexican investment declined even faster than foreign investment went up for the simple reason that Mexican businesses can't compete with highly subsidized U.S. Corporate systems. As for regulating corporations, there's very little in the way of international law on that. That's mostly, it's mostly the responsibility of the states in which the corporations are technically located. And you're right, there's a very weak regulatory apparatus, and the reasons are not a deep secret. It's that states and corporations are very tightly linked. To a very large extent, concentrated private power just dominates the state. In fact, even staffs it. So they're very unlikely to regulate it. And it sets the constraints in which state policy is made. Well, that shouldn't be true. There should, again, democratization of societies would reduce that. In fact, in my opinion, corporations are themselves illegitimate. I take a very conservative position on this. As you may know, when the modern corporation was created about a century ago by state intervention, mostly judicial intervention, no legislation about it. But when corporate law in the current sense was established in the early 20th century by the courts, there were people who bitterly opposed it, namely conservatives. There used to be conservatives in those days. Now the term's around, but not the concept. Conservatives bitterly condemned it as a return to feudalism, which in a way it was, and a form of communism. That was the reaction to the radical revision of corporate law in the United States and elsewhere to grant corporations, collectivist legal entities, the rights of people of flesh and blood. As a major attack against classical liberal principles. And conservatives, meaning classical liberals, were bitterly offended by that. And I think they had a good point. Well, since that time, it's gotten a lot worse. The decisions, if you look through corporate law, it has, I'll talk about the United States, but it's not very different elsewhere, major decisions about 80 years ago, 90 years ago, by the courts, determined that corporations are not only persons, but they are necessarily pathological persons. That is, they determined that a corporation, the corporate management must dedicate itself to increasing profit and market share, whatever the effect on anyone. For a corporation to do anything benevolent was determined to be illegal. That was the issue that came up. I'll go through the court case if you like. And that's been fortified by further corporate law, mostly in the courts, not legislation. The corporations are allowed to do something benevolent if the TV cameras are on. So if you're doing it for public relations purposes, yeah, then you're allowed to do something nice. In fact, the courts have gone so far as to advise corporations that they should carry out benign acts, or else, I'm now quoting, an aroused public may discover what you're up to and what the government is up to and take away your privileges. So you better do nice things to prevent an aroused public to find out what's going on. In the recent international trade agreements, which do provide a kind of a framework for corporate behavior, corporations are given rights that go way beyond persons. So if General Motors, let's say, invests in Mexico, they can demand what's called national treatment. They have to be treated like some Mexican mom-and-pop business. If a Mexican of flesh and blood comes to New York and asks for national treatment, he'll be lucky if he's not sent to Guantanamo. The reason is that private tyrannies, collectivist private tyrannies, legally created entities, are given rights way beyond persons by the so-called trade agreements, which don't have much to do with trade, certainly not with free trade. Well, you know, all of that can be changed.
Private tyrannies? What do you mean by private? You said private tyrannies?
Yeah, a corporation's a private tyranny. A corporation, if you look at its structure, is about as close to the totalitarian model as anything that human beings have created. Control is completely from top down. You can be inserted in the middle somewhere, like junior manager. Take orders from the top down. From the top, you hand them down below. At the very bottom, people are allowed to rent themselves to it. It's called getting a job. There's a very weak accountability to the public, extremely weak. And when you get, when the right wing comes into power, like the Reagan administration or the Bush administration, their primary goal is to weaken the regulatory apparatus. So the Reagan administration, for example, essentially informed the corporate world that they were not going to enforce the regulations on business practices. You can read all about it in Business Week, which had good reports about it, and described how, the number of illegal firings of union organizers, I think, tripled, shot up, and other labor abuses shot up, because the government simply said, we're not going to enforce the law, so do what you like. And they did what they liked. So yes, there's a very real question about the legitimacy of the institution in the first place. But insofar as it exists, and again, let me stress, I'm taking a very conservative position on this. That is was the position of conservatives when they did really exist, with justice. So that's a serious question. But if they exist, yeah, they should be accountable to the public. And that means in many respects. For example, there's no, it's not a law of nature that they should work for the benefit of shareholders. Shareholders doesn't mean somebody who has $5 in a mutual fund. Corporate ownership is very highly concentrated. The top 1% of the population probably holds about half of it. So there's no law that says that they should, there happens to be a law, but there shouldn't be one, not a justifiable law that says that they should work for the benefit of the tiny percentage of the population that happens to own the country. Why not for what are called stakeholders? Meaning the community, the workforce, future generations because of the effects they have on environment and so on. Yeah, those are reasonable proposals, and there's no reason why a democratic society should enforce them.